My mum's parents are from the Sylhet district in Bangladesh. Sitting in the Ganges Delta between India and Myanmar, Bangladesh is perfect birdwatching country, and also a part of my heritage. My sister Aisha spent her early childhood within the bosom of my extended Bangladeshi family. Mum was on her own with a baby. She needed their help and they gave it willingly. Aisha was raised not only by mum, but by an army of aunts and uncles and my grandparents too. Our Nanabai loved her so much he would often bring home her favourite dish from his restaurant, tandoori chicken. In many ways, her childhood was entirely different to mine. While my grandparents had eventually welcomed Dad into the family, he wasn't the first white boy that Mum had married. It was still a bit of a shock when she introduced him to them as her fiancé. But as long as he was willing to look after Mum and Aisha, they were happy enough. Mum and my sister had lived with my grandparents for a period, but now Dad was around, and my own experience of my extended Bangladeshi family wasn't nearly as intense as Aisha's. I felt like so many children from immigrant families, as though I was growing up between two cultures, never fully belonging to one or the other. But my identity crisis was resolved each time we went to Bangladesh. There, I'm treated as one of their own. There's a Bangla word, bilati, which is used to refer to relatives and friends who live here in Britain. There's lots of love and affection in this word and within these long-distance relationships. My Bangladeshi relatives understand that young people growing up abroad will have assimilated to a new culture, and they make allowances for the subtle and not so subtle ways that we're different. The colour of Dad's skin never mattered much to them, and I'm always treated as just another family member who happens to have been born and raised in the UK. Everyone has expectations about dual heritage children and how they resolve this feeling of identity. But essentially the confusion I felt had more to do with how people reacted to me. I was Asian to my white friends and white to Asian people. With every visit to Bangladesh, I made a more conscious effort to reconnect with my family, and I began to feel more comfortable in my skin by actively choosing to explore my roots. And because Bangladesh is so important to me, so are its birds. Sanadia Island in Bangladesh is one of the locations the spoon-billed sandpiper chooses to migrate to during the winter, and in February 2015, Mum and I headed over to join a task force to make count of the birds on the southern coast. I had decided to use my growing platform, my blog had hit almost 1 million views, to campaign for the vulnerable bird. Given I'm also Bangla, I leveraged my platform and ethnicity to gain wider attention. The last time I'd been in Bangladesh, it had been, as usual, a whirlwind of aunts and uncles and cousins, which involved driving long distances between towns and villages to make sure we had connected with every one of what felt like at least 1,000 relatives. This trip was going to be very different. We were picked up at the airport by my mum's uncle Joshim. He hadn't seen her since 2011, when he visited her in hospital in Bristol. They laughed about how she'd been high as a kite the last time he'd seen Mum in Bangladesh. High on mania, that is. Mum was much better, but I couldn't help recalling the last visit, picturing Dad waving us off as he boarded the plane to come home, only to have to follow us a few days later because Mum was so ill. I pushed this thought away. Mum was good, and Dad wouldn't have let us come if he was in any doubt about her health. Just like the geese who arrive in the UK during the winter from Greenland or Scandinavia, the spoon-billed sandpiper leaves the Arctic tundra in Russia, migrating to countries such as Bangladesh, where the food is plentiful during the bleaker months. With the erosion of the mudflats in Russia and China, the conservation of the bird became more difficult, which is why international cooperation was so crucial if the habitat of the sandpiper was to be saved. The project felt urgent, and for the first time I was personally involved, however tiny my contribution, in helping the species thrive. While I had thrown myself into campaigning for the Sandpiper Project on social media, there was something very different about physically interacting with these precious birds. It was peaceful. The reality behind the public campaigning was brought home to me as I stood knee-deep in mud. Everything was reduced to the simple action of counting the tiny birds.